Hey, welcome to another Quality Time. James here, Quality Lead at Dark Threat Fabrication. You can find us on the web at darkthreatfabrication.com. Got a special shout out this week to our in-studio guest, Sasquatch, otherwise known as Bigfoot. So we're continuing to look at the advances and the revolutions in industrial and quality movements throughout the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Last week we looked at industry and quality 1.0. This week we're at industry or quality 2.0, the second industrial revolution. Told you last week it was going to be electrifying, and that is exactly what industry 2.0 was all about, electricity. Some call this the technological revolution. Others called it the age of synergy. It was primarily located in Britain, Germany, and the United States of America. So the second industrial revolution started in the mid-19th century, 1840s, 1850s. It's hard to put a specific date on it. And it lasted until the beginning of the 20th century, and it had a very soft end. And next week I'll explain that hard, bitter, soft end to the Industrial Revolution 2.0. But one thing I want you to understand is that as much as Industry 1.0 changed the fabric of life, Industry 2.0, or the second Industrial Revolution, it changed the very fabric of life in an exponential way. Decision upon decision, advance upon advance, innovation upon innovation just changed the very fabric of what everyone knew life to be up to that point. One of the biggest things about Industry 2.0 is that it changed the very nature of work. No longer was work performed based upon the sun, but now it was based upon the clock. Work was no longer seasonal. And one of the most amazing things about Industry 2.0 is that 11 million people moved from farms into these new things called cities. So the foundation of Industry 2.0 was based upon two factors, and these two factors were foundational and huge in all that they led to in Industry 2.0. The first one was what I've been quoting time and time again, electrical power. Electricity. This was fuel to the fire. This caused much of the innovation, much of the technology, much of the advances in Industry 2.0 just alone because of electricity. It allowed for greater production. It allowed for more sophisticated machines. And now factories could be just placed just about anywhere. No longer did they have to be placed near a water source. As long as you could get electricity to your factory and to your machines, you could effectively put it wherever you wanted to. And number two, mass production via assembly lines. Mass production and assembly lines, two things that work together in harmony to speed up the pace and the volume of production in ways up until now just were not possible. Now, Henry Ford was the king of mass production and the assembly line. He unlocked the key for his automotive factories to increase pace, increase volume, and to reduce cost. Prior to the assembly line, it took workers several hundred hours per automobile to put it together. After Henry Ford put the assembly line and mass production into operation in his factories, that number had dropped down to about 75 hours per automobile. Quite a savings in time. And about cost, Henry Ford was a major innovator when it came to reducing cost. When the Model T first came out, the Model T cost about $780. In 1916, he had dropped the price down to $360. And at the end of 1924, he had further dropped the price down to about $290, and that was on 2 million units. So the increased volume and the reduced cost afforded many people their first automobile. They could afford it. It was something that they could attain. Phenomenal job by Henry Ford. But I do want to say that this advance came with a little bit of a downsize. In 1921, Henry Ford laid off 25% of his workforce. They were just simply no longer needed. But what was astonishing was that even though he laid off 25% of his workforce, average worker productivity increased by 23%. So while there were not as many jobs, the jobs that there were much easier and much more efficient. So these two factors alone, mass production via assembly line and electrical power, those two factors alone led to all kinds of advances. And it was a very rapid advance in Industry 2.0. I know you may have guessed from last week that Industry 1.0 was rapid. Industry 2.0 was very rapid. The advances, the technological innovations that came about and that almost stacked one on top of the other. I don't have time to discuss all of the advances and all the technical innovations in Industry 2.0, but I would like to bring out just a few points just so you could see what was going on. In Industry 2.0, one of the big things was steel production. Steel became almost the king of materials. Steel had a lifetime of 10 times that of iron. Railroads became the primary shipping mode. No longer was I limited to waterways, and if you remember, I didn't have to worry about where my factories were because as long as I could get electricity there, I could have a factory anywhere. Now with railroads, I could ship my goods large volumes over large distances, and I didn't have to worry about where were the waterways. So again, another technological advancement in just the very area of what we would say supply chain and development and delivery today. The railways alone in the United States between the years of 1860 and 1880, the number of railroad miles increased by a factor of 300%. And then by 1920, it had grown an additional 300%. So you see the railway went just about everywhere. We could spend some time, but we won't spend much, but we will just mention it, that the internal combustion engine began to become a prime mover for power. Telecommunications were a great advance. Both the telephone and the telegraph. And it was not primarily just the transfer of sounds, but it was the transfer of ideas that was made possible. And advances in chemicals were profound at this time. No longer did farmers have to worry about a whole-scale crop failure. By advances in chemicals, new fertilizers allowed more to be farmed and more goods to be produced. And it was in Industry 2.0 that big capital Q began to be formed. It was the formative years. It's still in its infancy, but it began to hit full stride in Industry 2.0. And another thing that happened in Industry 2.0 is these new things that were called corporations. Big, huge factories. Some that specialized in one thing, others that specialized in multiple things. But corporations began to be the heyday of Industry 2.0. For example, in 1901, United States Steel became America's first $1 billion corporation in 1901. It's also in Industry 2.0 and Quality 2.0 that management programs began to deal with the pace, the scale, and the quality of production. And I'm not going to lie to you, but even in Industry 2.0, trying to balance pace, scale, volume, and quality was, believe it or not, always last. But quality did come before people. It was also during Industry 2.0 that the divisions of labor became a big thing. Jobs were divided based upon specialized skills. Skilled workers became the main focus. And also, and this may shock you, but two concepts that we think are pretty modern, they began to form: just-in-time manufacturing and lean manufacturing. Both principles, although we think are very new, they began their infancy in Industry 2.0. But what really brought quality to capital Q in Industry 2.0 was a book that changed everything. In 1911, Frederick W. Taylor published his book entitled The Principles of Scientific Management. And this was the first time that scientific principles were applied to manufacturing, for pace, for volume, and for quality. This book is very interesting, but in 2001, The Principles of Scientific Management was voted the most influential management book of the 20th century by the Fellows of the Academy of Management. So 100 years later, almost, this book was still considered to be the preeminent source for scientific management in a manufacturing environment. And then it was a little bit later that in 1920, a man by the name of Walter Shewhart kind of built upon the scientific method and started coming up with what we would call process, control, and control charts. So as we see, brick upon brick, Big Q is beginning. So that brings us to the end of Industry 2.0. And I told you that Industry 2.0 kind of had a soft but a very dark end. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that next week, about how Industry 2.0, the very focus of it and the very focus of industry had to change worldwide because of events that were going on in our world. It's a dark time, but it's something that needs to be discussed. Hey, again, thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for watching these videos. Be sure to link up with us on the web. We'll talk to you next time.